All right, you degenerates, welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're going to dig into some seriously fucked up shit.
Oh, yeah.
The white movement
Okay.
during the Russian Civil War.
All right.
So you probably think you know
Yeah.
all about the Reds
Mm-hmm.
versus the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Right. But let's cut the crap.
Okay.
There's a whole other layer of crazy most folks haven't even heard about.
Really?
The whites, who were so pissed off about the commies taking over
Yeah, I see.
that they actually wanted to bring back
Oh.
the Tsar
Wow.
in the freaking 20th century.
Yeah.
What the hell were these guys thinking?
Well, it's not as simple as it sounds.
Like
The term white in this context doesn't have anything to do with race.
oh, really?
Yeah, it was more about being the opposite of the Reds. You know, those Bolsheviks with their fancy red flags and all that revolutionary jazz?
Yeah.
Think of it as the ultimate fuck you to the whole communist takeover.
So we've got the commies with their red flags
Yeah.
and these whites.
Yeah.
But why the hell call themselves white?
Uh-huh.
Were they just colorblind or something?
Actually, there's a historical connection to Tsar Ivan III.
Really?
Yeah, who was sometimes called the White King way back in the 15th century.
Okay.
Kind of ironic, right?
Yeah.
A bunch of dudes in the 20th century trying to drag Russia back to the Tsarist era while naming themselves after some ancient ruler.
Wow.
Plus, some white army soldiers wore white uniforms,
Okay.
which, you know,
I get you.
adds to the whole symbolism thing.
Okay, so we've got this
Right.
red versus white thing down.
Yep.
But what did these whites actually want?
Hmm.
I mean, besides not
Yeah.
being ruled by a bunch of commies.
That's where it gets really interesting and really fucked up.
Okay.
See, the white movement wasn't exactly a well-oiled machine
Right.
of political thought.
Uh-huh.
It was more like a giant dumpster fire of different ideologies.
Right.
Yeah, all crammed together. You had monarchists who were all about bringing back the czar,
Okay.
Republicans wanting some sort of democracy,
White.
right-wingers, liberals.
Oh.
It was a total shit show of contradictions.
Like,
Like a bunch of drunk teenagers trying to plan a world domination scheme.
so basically their main goal was fuck the Bolsheviks.
Pretty much.
And the rest was just like details.
As much.
Wow. So their hatred for the Bolsheviks
Right.
was the only thing they could agree on.
Yeah, like they were so busy hating the Reds
I see.
that they forgot to actually figure out what the hell they wanted for Russia.
Okay.
And that's a problem when you're trying to win a civil war and,
Right.
you know, actually run a country.
All right. So their ideology was about as coherent
Yeah.
as a drunken monkey's ramblings.
Uh-huh. Pretty much.
But what about their army?
Yeah.
With the whole white army thing?
Uh-huh.
Just as screwed up.
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Imagine a bunch of cats trying to herd sheep.
Okay.
That's basically the White Army in a nutshell.
Uh-huh. All right.
They were a bunch of different factions,
Uh-huh.
each with their own commanders and agendas,
Okay.
rarely working together.
I see.
Some were hardened veterans from World War I,
Okay.
while others were basically just pissed off peasants with rusty rifles.
Damn.
It was a recipe for disaster.
So not exactly a well-oiled military machine, huh?
No.
More like a rusty tractor.
Yeah,
Held together with duct tape and prayers.
exactly. And that lack of unity and organization
Sure.
is a major reason why they ultimately got their asses handed to them.
Speaking of getting their asses handed to them,
Yeah.
I've been reading some seriously fucked up stuff
Oh, really?
about these white army guys.
Mm.
Some of them sound like straight up war criminals.
Yeah.
Like way worse than your average
Yeah.
kill the enemy bullshit.
Yeah, that's the dark underbelly of the white movement.
Really?
Some units were responsible for some truly horrific shit,
Yeah.
especially against Jews. There were pogroms, massacres, you name it. Their propaganda even went as far as saying that Jews must pay for everything,
Hey.
including the revolution itself.
Wow.
They even dusted off the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Okay.
You know, that old anti-Semitic hoax
Right.
to spread their hateful bullshit.
Damn, talk about doubling down on crazy.
Yeah.
Felt like these guys were competing for the title of most fucked up army of the 20th century.
It was bad.
Wow.
Even Winston Churchill,
Really?
who was kind of on their side, had to warn one of their leaders,
I see.
General Denikin,
Mhm.
about all the atrocities his troops were committing.
Wow.
Basically, Churchill was like,
Yeah.
Dude, if you keep this shit up, no one's going to want to help you.
So even their allies
Yeah.
were calling him out for being a bunch of murderous assholes.
Yeah, it got to the point where
Exactly.
even people who hated the Bolsheviks
Okay.
couldn't stomach
Yeah.
the white movement's brutality.
Right.
It became a huge stain on their reputation. And it definitely didn't win them many fans in the international community.
All right. So we've got
Yeah.
a chaotic ideology that's basically fuck the Bolsheviks,
Right.
a disorganized army that can't work together,
Uh-huh.
and a whole lot of war crimes.
Yeah.
Let's cut to the chase.
Okay.
These guys got their asses kicked right.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Really?
The White Army fought on several fronts.
Okay.
The Southern Front,
Mm-hmm.
the Eastern Front in Siberia,
Okay.
and the Northern and Northwestern fronts.
Wow.
They even had help
Really?
from foreign powers,
Yeah.
like Japan, the UK, France, and the US.
Damn.
But it wasn't enough. The Red Army was just too strong,
Okay.
too organized,
Mm.
and frankly, less batshit crazy.
So even with foreign backing,
Yeah.
these guys still managed to fuck it up.
They did.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
For a movement that can't even agree on why it's fighting.
It's a classic example of how a lack of unity
Right.
and a clear vision can lead to total failure.
Right.
They were fighting a war on multiple fronts,
Wow.
both literally and metaphorically. And in the end,
Yeah.
it was their own internal divisions
Uh-huh.
that helped seal their fate.
All right. So we've established that the white movement was a total clusterfuck
Yep.
of conflicting ideologies, a disorganized army,
Right.
and a penchant for some
Whoa.
seriously messed up shit.
Right.
But before we go
Go.
full-on history textbook on this,
Yeah.
let's zoom in on some of the crazier details. Because, you know, what's a deep dive without some
Yeah.
juicy, unexpected bullshit?
Oh, there's plenty of that.
I bet.
For example, did you know that one of the White Army leaders, General Anton Denikin,
Yeah.
actually advocated for
Okay.
a more democratic system for Russia?
Wait, seriously.
Yeah.
This guy,
Uh-huh.
who was fighting to restore the Tsar,
Yeah.
also wanted the people to have a say in their government.
Kinda, yeah.
What the fuck was he thinking?
It's a fascinating glimpse into
Okay.
the complexities of the white movement.
Okay.
While many were diehard monarchists,
Right.
there were also those who recognized
Yeah.
that Russia needed to modernize
Okay.
and embrace some level
Uh-huh.
of democratic principles.
I see.
Of course, Denikin's vision of democracy
Yeah.
probably wasn't quite as progressive as what we might think of today,
I bet.
but it's still a notable departure
Right.
from the bring back the Tsar crowd.
So even within the white movement,
Yeah.
there were some
No.
glimmers of progressive thought.
Yeah.
It's like they were accidentally stumbling towards democracy
Kinda.
while trying to drag Russia back to the Middle Ages.
It's one of the many ironies of the white movement.
Yeah.
They were a coalition of opposites, united only by their hatred for the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
And that internal conflict
Crazy.
ultimately played a major role in their downfall.
All right. So we've got a bunch of anti-communist, czar-loving, democracy-dabbling,
Yeah,
war criming.
pretty much.
I'm starting to get a headache
Uh-huh.
just trying to keep track of all this.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of history, right? It's
Definitely.
full of surprises, contradictions,
Right.
and messy human stories.
All right. So we've laid the groundwork
Okay.
for this deep dive
Yeah.
into the white movement.
Uh-huh.
We've got our cast of characters,
Uh-huh.
the red-hating whites
Right.
with their dumpster fire of ideologies,
Yeah.
their chaotic army that couldn't organize a picnic,
Uh-huh.
and their tendency to do some seriously fucked up shit.
Yeah.
But we've only scratched the surface here.
Right.
There's a lot more to uncover, so buckle up,
Okay.
because we're going even deeper
All right.
into this historical shit show.
Let's do it. So you want to delve deeper into this historical shit show?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Okay, let's talk about the White Army's structure, or rather the lack thereof.
Uh-huh.
It was like trying to herd cats,
Okay.
each faction with its own leader and ideas.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. It's mind-boggling how they thought they could win a war being that disorganized. Like, were there any white armies that were actually, competent? Or was it all just a bunch of drunken Cossacks stumbling around with rifles?
Well, there were some units that were more organized and effective than others. For example, the Volunteer Army,
Okay.
led by Denikin, had a core of experienced officers and soldiers from the Tsarist army.
Okay.
They were actually a pretty formidable fighting force in the early stages of the Civil War.
So it wasn't all just a bunch of random dudes with guns who hated commies. There were some actual soldiers in the mix.
Yeah, but even the volunteer army had its problems.
Okay.
Denikin's authority was constantly challenged by other white leaders, and there was a lot of infighting and rivalry within their ranks. Plus, their reliance on conscription and forced recruitment meant that a lot of their soldiers weren't exactly enthusiastic about fighting for the white cause.
So even the good white armies were still riddled with internal bullshit.
Yeah.
And let's be real, forcing people to fight for you is never a good look. It's like,
Right.
hey, join our side or we'll shoot you. Not exactly a winning recruitment strategy.
Yeah, and that's another reason why the White Army struggled. They lacked the kind of ideological fervor
I see.
that drove the Red Army.
Right.
For a lot of white soldiers, it was more about survival than some grand vision for Russia.
Which is understandable given the whole life or death situation they were in.
Yeah.
But damn, it must have been pretty demoralizing to be fighting for a cause you didn't really believe in while also getting your ass kicked by a bunch of fanatical commies.
Absolutely. Morale was a huge problem for the White Army throughout the war. They were constantly on the retreat, losing battles, and seeing their comrades die for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless.
So it wasn't just the external pressure from the Reds, but also the internal rot that was eating away at them.
Exactly. And that internal rot was fueled by the white movement's own contradictions. They were trying to appeal to a broad base of support, but they couldn't articulate a clear, coherent vision for the future of Russia.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
Their ideology was basically, we hate commies, and that's about it. Not exactly a rallying cry to inspire the masses.
And that lack of a unifying vision made it impossible for them to build a lasting movement. They were constantly fighting amongst themselves, undermining their own efforts, and alienating potential allies.
It's like they were shooting themselves in the foot with every other step they took. And all the while, the Bolsheviks were over there united and determined, just waiting to pick up the pieces.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. The white movement was ultimately defeated by its own internal weaknesses as much as by the strength of the Red Army.
Okay, so we've established that the White Army was a bit of a shit show in terms of organization and morale. But what about their leadership? Who the hell was calling the shots for these guys?
Well, the leadership was just as messy and chaotic as everything else about the white movement. They did have a supreme governor of Russia, but the position was mostly symbolic, and the real power lay with the various regional commanders.
So basically, it was a free-for-all with a bunch of wannabe dictators running around.
Yeah.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It pretty much was. Each commander had his own agenda, his own army, and his own ideas about how to fight the war. There was very little coordination or cooperation between them, and they were constantly undermining each other with petty rivalries and power struggles.
So even at the top, it was just a bunch of egos clashing.
Yeah.
Talk about a dysfunctional family.
It was a classic example of too many cooks in the kitchen. And when the kitchen is on fire and everyone's running around screaming, that's not a good recipe for success.
So who are some of these chefs who are supposed to be leading the white movement to victory? Give us the rundown on the big names.
All right, well, one of the most prominent figures was Admiral Alexander Kolchak.
Okay.
He was a tough, experienced naval officer who emerged as the leader of the white forces in Siberia.
Okay.
After the Bolsheviks executed the Tsar and his family.
So this Kolchak guy was like, okay, the Tsar is dead, but we're still going to fight for the monarchy. Talk about clinging to the past.
Yeah, Kolchak was a staunch monarchist, and he saw himself as the rightful heir to the Tsar's authority. He was a ruthless and determined leader, and he had some early successes in Siberia, but he was ultimately defeated by the Red Army in 1920.
So even the supreme leader of the white movement couldn't pull it off. Sounds like these guys were cursed from the start.
Well, they were certainly facing an uphill battle.
Right.
The Red Army had a number of advantages, including a more unified command structure,
I see.
a more motivated fighting force, and better access to resources and supplies.
So it wasn't just bad leadership and infighting that doomed the whites. The Reds actually had some shit going for them.
Yeah, absolutely. The Bolsheviks were a formidable opponent. They were ruthless and determined, and they were willing to do whatever it took to win. Plus, they had a clear ideological message
Right.
that resonated with many Russians who were tired of the old order.
So while the whites were arguing amongst themselves about who should be in charge, the Reds were out there winning hearts and minds. That's gotta sting.
It definitely played a role in the outcome of the war.
I bet.
The Bolsheviks were able to mobilize the masses in a way that the whites simply couldn't.
Okay.
They promised land to the peasants, peace to the war-weary, and a new, more just society for everyone.
So even if they were full of shit, at least they had a good story to tell.
Exactly. And in a time of chaos and upheaval, a good story can be a powerful weapon.
Okay, so we've got Kolchak, the supreme leader, who couldn't lead shit.
Yeah.
Who else were these masterminds who were supposed to be running the white movement?
Well, another prominent figure was General Anton Denikin,
Yeah.
who we mentioned earlier. He was the leader of the Volunteer Army, which was one of the most effective white fighting forces in the early stages of the war. Denikin was a more complex figure than Kolchak.
Okay.
He was a monarchist at heart, but he also recognized the need for some degree of political reform.
So he was like a czar-loving, democracy-curious war crime committing. It's hard to keep track of all these contradictions.
Yeah, Denikin was a man of contradictions.
Okay.
He was a skilled military leader, but he was also a ruthless and uncompromising figure.
Right.
He was initially successful in driving north from the Caucasus towards Moscow, but his advance was eventually halted by the Red Army, and he was forced to flee to Crimea in 1920.
So another white leader bites the dust. Sounds like a pattern here.
Yeah, the white movement was plagued by a series of defeats and setbacks. Their inability to unite, their lack of a clear vision, and their brutal tactics all contributed to their downfall.
Right, so we've got Kolchak and Denikin, two white leaders who, despite their best efforts, couldn't outsmart, outmaneuver, or out-bullshit the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Who else was there? Was there anyone who could actually pose a threat to the Reds?
Well, there was one more notable figure, General Pyotr Wrangel. He was known as the Black Baron because of his black Cossack uniform. He took over command of the white forces in Crimea after Denikin's defeat and tried to reorganize and revitalize the movement.
So this Wrangel guy was like the white movement's last hope, the Hail Mary pass at the end of the game.
He was definitely their last chance. Wrangel was a shrewd and capable leader, and he managed to hold out in Crimea for longer than many expected, but he was ultimately facing overwhelming odds. The Red Army had control of most of Russia, and they were determined to crush the last remnants of the white resistance.
So even the Black Baron couldn't pull off a miracle. It's almost like the white movement was destined to fail from the beginning.
Well, they were certainly facing a lot of challenges, but Wrangel did manage to achieve one important thing. He oversaw the evacuation of over 130,000 white soldiers and civilians from Crimea to safety in other countries.
So at least he saved some people from the Bolshevik meat grinder. A small victory amidst the larger defeat, I guess.
Yeah, it was a testament to Wrangel's leadership and his commitment to his troops.
I see.
He refused to abandon them to their fate, and he risked his own life to ensure their escape.
Damn, that's actually pretty badass. Too bad the rest of the white movement wasn't as competent or compassionate.
It's a tragic story. In many ways, the white movement was a product of its time,
Yeah.
a reaction to the chaos and upheaval of the Russian Revolution. But it was also flawed from the start, riddled with contradictions and unable to offer a compelling alternative to the Bolsheviks' vision for the future.
So we've got Kolchak, Denikin, and Wrangel. 3 white leaders, 3 different approaches, 3 inevitable defeats. It sounds like the only thing these guys were good at was losing.
They were certainly fighting a losing battle from the beginning. But it's important to remember that they weren't all evil villains twirling their mustaches and plotting world domination. They were complex individuals with their own motivations, beliefs, and flaws.
Yeah, even the bad guys in history are still human beings. But let's be real, some of these white leaders were pretty damn close to mustache-twirling villains.
That's true. Some of them were definitely more ruthless and bloodthirsty than others.
Right.
But it's also important to remember that they were operating in a context of extreme violence and chaos. The Russian Civil War was a brutal conflict, and atrocities were committed on both sides.
So it wasn't just the whites who were being dicks. The Reds had their fair share of blood on their hands, too.
Absolutely. The Bolsheviks were just as capable of brutality and repression as their opponents. In fact, they arguably took it to a whole other level with the Red Terror, which was a campaign of mass arrests, executions, and torture, targeting anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution.
Damn, the Red Terror. That sounds pretty fucking terrifying.
It was a dark chapter in Russian history. Millions of people were killed or imprisoned during the Red Terror, and it left a lasting legacy of fear and paranoia in Soviet society.
So basically both sides were playing the who can be more fucked up game. It sounds like the Russian people were caught in the middle of a real shit show.
It was a truly horrific time to be alive in Russia. The Civil War tore the country apart, and the violence and chaos touched the lives of everyone.
All right, so we've talked about the white movement's leadership, their lack of organization, their morale problems, and their tendency to get their asses handed to them. But what about their propaganda? How did they try to sell their message to the Russian people? Did they just yell, fuck commies really loudly, or was there more to it than that?
Well, their propaganda was just as messy and contradictory as their ideology. They tried to appeal to a wide range of audiences, from conservative monarchists to liberal Democrats, but they often ended up alienating potential supporters with their mixed messaging and inconsistent rhetoric.
So they were trying to be all things to all people and ended up pleasing no one. Classic marketing fail.
Pretty much. Their propaganda was often heavy-handed and preachy, relying on outdated Tsarist imagery and appeals to traditional values. They also frequently resorted to fear-mongering and demonizing the Bolsheviks, painting them as bloodthirsty barbarians who were destroying Russia.
Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate considering the whole Red Terror thing we just talked about.
Right. But the problem was that the whites' own brutality and association with anti-Semitism undermined their attempts to present themselves as the moral high ground.
So they were trying to call the kettle black. Not exactly a winning strategy.
Exactly. And that's why their propaganda ultimately failed to win over the hearts and minds of the Russian people. It lacked authenticity, consistency, and a clear vision for the future.
It's almost like they were trying to rewind the clock back to the Tsarist era,
Yeah.
which, let's face it, wasn't exactly a golden age for most Russians.
Right. They were clinging to this idealized version of the past that had very little relevance to the realities of the post-revolutionary world.
I see.
And that disconnect made it impossible for them to connect with the masses.
So instead of offering a compelling alternative to the Bolsheviks, they just ended up looking like a bunch of out-of-touch elites trying to reclaim their lost privileges.
Exactly. And that's why their propaganda efforts ultimately fell flat. They couldn't compete with the Bolsheviks' revolutionary zeal and their promise of a new, more equitable society.
Right, so we've covered the white movement's leadership, their army, their propaganda. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the international context. Because, no historical shit show is complete without some foreign meddling.
Absolutely. The Russian Civil War wasn't just an internal conflict, it was also a proxy war between the major powers of the time.
So basically everyone was trying to get their fingers in the Russian pie.
Exactly. The Bolsheviks had the support of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later the Soviet Union,
Yep.
while the whites received backing from the Allied powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan.
So it's like a global team death match with Russia as the battleground.
Yeah, kind of. The Allied powers were concerned about the spread of communism, and they saw the white movement as a bulwark against Bolshevik expansion. They provided the whites with financial aid, weapons, and even some military personnel.
So the whites were basically pawns in a bigger geopolitical game. Talk about being used.
That's one way to look at it. The Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War was motivated by a mix of idealism and self-interest. They wanted to support democracy and freedom in Russia, but they were also concerned about protecting their own interests in the region.
So it was a bit of a, we're doing this for you, but also for us situation. Classic power politics.
Yeah, and ultimately, the Allied intervention was a failure. They underestimated the strength of the Bolsheviks, and they overestimated the effectiveness of the white movement. Plus, there was a lot of disagreement among the Allied powers about how involved they should be in the conflict.
So basically, the whites were getting half-assed support from a bunch of countries that couldn't agree on what they were trying to achieve. Sounds like a recipe for disaster yet again.
It certainly didn't help their cause.
Yeah.
The lack of a unified strategy and the limited resources provided by the Allies meant that the white movement was always at a disadvantage.
So even with foreign help, these guys were still screwed. It's almost like they were cursed, I tell you.
Well, they were certainly facing overwhelming odds. The Red Army had the advantage of fighting on their own soil.
Right.
They had a more unified command structure, and they had a more motivated fighting force.
All right, so the white movement was a shit show from top to bottom. Bad leadership, disorganized army, terrible propaganda, and half-assed support from their foreign buddies. But what about the impact on ordinary people? What was it like for a regular Joe, or Ivan, I guess, living in white-controlled territory? Were they all about bringing back the Tsar, or were they just trying to survive?
Well, life under white rule was pretty grim for most people. The economy was in shambles, there were food shortages, and disease was rampant.
Yeah.
Plus, the white armies were notorious for their brutality and their tendency to loot and pillage.
So basically, it was a choose-your-own-adventure of shitty options.
Yeah.
Die of starvation, get shot by the Bolsheviks, or get robbed by the White Army. Sounds like a real blast.
It definitely wasn't a picnic. The Russian people were caught in the crossfire of a brutal civil war, and they suffered immensely, regardless of which side they supported.
Damn, that's heavy. So even if you weren't a diehard communist or a Tsar-loving maniac, you were still going to have a bad time.
Yeah, the Russian Civil War was a tragedy for everyone involved. It was a time of unimaginable violence, suffering, and loss.
All right, so we've explored the fucked upness of the white movement from every angle. Their ideology, their army, their leadership, their propaganda, and the impact on ordinary people.
Yeah.
But we've only scratched the surface of this whole historical shit show. There's still so much more to unpack, so get ready because we're about to go even deeper.
So you want to delve even deeper into the impact on ordinary Russians.
Oh yeah, let's get into it.
Let's talk about the different factions within the white movement itself. Remember, it wasn't just a monolithic bloc. There were all sorts of characters with wildly varying beliefs and goals.
Yeah, we've already touched on the whole clusterfuck of ideologies thing.
Yeah.
But give us the dirt, man. Who were some of the crazier players in this white movement circus? Yeah, I bet there were some real whack jobs in the mix.
Oh, there were plenty. Take, for example, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. This guy was a straight-up warlord operating in Mongolia and Siberia.
Okay.
He believed he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and had a penchant for mystical bullshit and brutal repression.
Hold up. Reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Was this guy serious, or was he just on some crazy Siberian drugs?
Dead serious, man. Ungern-Sternberg was a real piece of work.
Yeah.
He led this ragtag army of Mongols and Russians, leaving a trail of blood and chaos in his wake.
Okay.
He was obsessed with restoring the Mongol Empire and thought he was some kind of divinely appointed warrior destined to conquer the world.
Jesus Christ, this guy sounds like he walked straight out of a history-themed acid trip. Imagine living under his rule. It must have been like a nonstop horror movie.
It was pretty damn bad. He was known for his extreme cruelty and loved a good public execution. Torture was a favorite pastime.
Wow.
And anyone suspected of being a Bolshevik sympathizer was basically guaranteed a one-way ticket to the afterlife.
So basically he was the white movement's version of a supervillain? Like if they made a comic book about the Russian Civil War,
Yeah.
this guy would be the main antagonist.
He'd definitely be a memorable villain.
Yeah.
Ungern-Sternberg embodied the darkest aspects of the white cause. The violence, the fanaticism, and the total disregard for human life.
Damn, so for people living in white-controlled territory, it was like playing Russian roulette with your sanity.
Yeah.
You might end up under the rule of a somewhat decent commander who just wanted to restore order, or you might get stuck with some Genghis Khan wannabe who thought torture was a good way to spend a Tuesday afternoon.
Exactly. And that unpredictability made it almost impossible for people to plan for the future, let alone just survive from day to day.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to live a normal life when you have no idea if the next guy in charge is going to be a reasonable human being or a complete psychopath.
Talk about a stressful way to live. It's no wonder so many people were just trying to get the hell out of Russia.
It was a truly brutal time for everyone involved. The Russian Civil War wasn't just a clash of ideologies. It was a human tragedy of epic proportions. Millions of people died, countless others were displaced, and the entire country was left scarred by the violence and chaos.
So after all this talk about the white movement's fucked upness, their disastrous leadership, their insane warlords, and their tendency to make life miserable for everyone around them, what's the big takeaway here? What should our listeners be pondering after this deep dive?
I think the main takeaway is that history is rarely simple or straightforward. The white movement was a complex and contradictory force,
Okay.
driven by a mix of noble ideals, selfish ambitions, and sheer desperation. They were fighting for a cause they couldn't even clearly define, and their internal divisions ultimately doomed them to failure.
So it's not just about learning the facts, but also understanding the context, the motivations, the human stories behind those historical events.
Exactly. The white movement story is a reminder that even the losers in history have their own stories to tell.
Okay.
And those stories can be just as fascinating, tragic, and thought-provoking as the stories of the victors.
Yeah, it's like even the bad guys are still human beings with their own hopes, dreams, and fucked upness. It's a good reminder that the world is never black and white, even when we're talking about historical events that seem pretty damn clear-cut.
Exactly. And I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind, especially in today's world where it's so easy to fall into simplistic narratives and demonize those who hold different views.
Damn, that's deep, man. I need a fucking drink after all this talk about historical trauma and the complexities of human nature.
Me too.
Cheers to unpacking the messy and often fucked up tapestry of history.
Cheers to that, and to all you beautiful bastards listening out there. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride through the Russian Civil War. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into some other corner of history. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and try not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Because you know it makes for a good story.